Good morning, everyone. I'm giving everyone a chance to log on. Looks like on my Zoom, we're kind of getting there. I know some folks are still getting their audio connected, so we'll just wait another second or two. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started as people are kind of just coming into the room. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Judy Reben. I'm Associate Director of JFK at University of Colorado School of Medicine. JFK partners and the Colorado Title V MCH program have collaboratively present a quarterly educational series to address the current Colorado Title V MCH priorities and emerging issues. This series is intended to expand the capacity of the maternal child health, workforce, and related systems to better serve infants, children, youth, including those with special healthcare needs and their families. Throughout this webinar today, we want you to feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat at any point. And while our speaker is doing her presentation, if there's something, I'm happy to do that. I'm a professor here and clinical psychologist and really passionate about this topic of mental health and individuals with IDD. So really welcome your questions at any point. We're going to ask folks to mute your microphone so that we don't hear the background noise. We are recording today's event and we'll archive it on the JFK Partners website. And we've already posted the handout for today. So I know folks like to see the handouts and it's already been posted so that you're welcome to print it or save it for your future reference. Following the webinar, you're going to receive a link with a survey and evaluation questions. You can request a certificate of attendance in the evaluation. So, as you probably know, today's topic is identifying and addressing mental health needs in children and teens with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Our presenter today is Dr. Rachel Sandercock. Dr. Sandercock joined JFK in June of 2020 and is currently a psychology postdoc fellow. She earned her PhD in clinical psych from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Dr. Sandercock has worked in a wide variety of clinical settings, including the Teach Autism Program, the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities, and the Marcus Autism Center, and has significant experience conducting evidence-based intervention and evaluation for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the lifespan. Her research interests include identifying early socio-communicative markers of autism, adapting mental health interventions for individuals with IDD, and supporting positive transition into adulthood. And on a personal note, I've worked with Rachel for the last couple of years, and I can tell you she's fantastic and really knows her stuff. And when we were approached with this topic, I thought, oh my gosh, let's get Rachel to do this. She's going to do a terrific job. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Rachel. Well, Dr. Sandercock.
All right. Thank you so much, Judy, for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here today to, as Judy mentioned, talk about identifying and addressing mental health needs in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I will just share my screen. 1 second. All right. All right, so our objectives today are really to talk about how do we identify the signs of emerging or ongoing mental health challenges, and then subsequently learn strategies and supports to manage those mental health challenges. And then, so we'll be talking through a lot of different ways in the classroom or at school to kind of start to address some of those things, but also to recognize when to refer to a mental health provider. So before we jump into that, it would be helpful just to get a sense, we got some background information about where everyone is coming from, but just to get a little more information about people's backgrounds so I can kind of tailor some of that information throughout the talk. So I think Christine was going to just launch a quick poll that has a little bit more specific questions about everybody's background. Yeah, I don't know where those results show up. Maybe if they're still coming in. All right. So it looks like we have a fair amount of family members, and then some speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, ABA providers, and some psychologists or mental health providers, and a self-advocate. All right. And then other. All right. So if you do want to put in the chat, it seems like a large percentage of people are checking off other. So if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, just what setting you're working in, or what your discipline or role is, that would be really helpful. Okay, so child welfare, educational settings, home and school services. Okay, child and adult advocate. Great. All right. Well, that's certainly helpful for me to know how to kind of best tailor some of the information as we're going through everything. Oops. So before we jump into it, I just want to talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about IDD, because that is a really broad category. So intellectual and developmental disabilities broadly are defined as disorders or disabilities that emerge within the developmental time period. So in the first 18 years of life, and that really uniquely affect the trajectory of someone's physical, intellectual, or emotional development. So when we talk about intellectual disability specifically, we're talking about impairment in intellectual functioning combined with adaptive behavior. So those daily living skills, self-care abilities, things like that. Other developmental disabilities include, but aren't limited to, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disorders, Down syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and there are many more that fall into that category. So when we're talking about IDD, we need to really recognize that it's not a monolith of presentation, that there's a lot of diversity in the challenges that people have and a lot of diversity in the strengths that people have. And so throughout, we'll be talking about kind of strategies in a broad way, but that a real takeaway is to think about how to tailor to the individual. So we know that supporting mental health is really an essential part of being able to support individuals with IDD at a base level. So 4 to 5 times more children and teens with IDD are diagnosed with mental health conditions as compared to those without disabilities. And at least a third of individuals with IDD have significant behavioral or mental health challenges that require mental health services. And so again, because we're talking about a really broad category of diagnoses, it's hard to get really clear data on what those numbers look like. And so these numbers are likely even an underestimate of those experiencing mental health symptoms that could require additional support. So when we're talking about mental health, I think an underlying base factor that needs to be acknowledged are the social determinants of mental health that we can talk about day to day. How does anxiety and depression present? We also need to think about the things that set us up to have positive mental health. And so we know that having increased physical strength, physiological strength can increase psychological strength or stress, sorry. And so those things come from societal factors like having less access to quality housing, instability around access to food, racial inequality. And so to be able to talk about mental health, day to day is also coming from a position of privilege and being able to operate under an assumption that people do have access to these things like safe and reliable housing and consistent food and, supportive caregiving systems. And so before thinking about, is someone requiring support for mental health specific symptoms, it's important to first step back and think about, are these person's needs being met? And what can we do potentially to make sure that those are being met to set us up for successful mental health outcomes? So related to that, The impact of COVID is also really important to acknowledge for all of us, including individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities that we are maybe working with or supporting, that COVID has really increased for all of us unpredictability, social isolation, amount of stress. For specific families, that could include financial stress and managing, homeschooling, or managing kind of new tasks that currently weren't happening inside of the home, coupled with an increased financial burden related to COVID. And this can really be tied to higher caregiver burnout. We also know, based on just Colorado data, and there was a recent article in the Denver Post about this, that there's been decreased access to services and decreased referrals to essential early intervention. So there's been a huge decline in school-based and community services over the course of COVID. And this particularly impacts the most vulnerable families. So as I was just talking about, those from low-income neighborhoods who might not have the same resources to kind of make it through COVID with a level of stress that feels manageable. Additionally, vulnerable families include those who have had infants in neonatal intensive care units who really benefit from early intervention and early support services, and families who speak a language other than English or Spanish, where services are already more reduced for other language speakers. But in the context of COVID, when there's less access to in-person resources, that accessing services in your native language can be even more challenging. So the most common mental health diagnoses, and the ones that we'll be really focusing on today, are attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety, and depression. So ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is sort of an interesting one, just because it does technically fall under the domain of a neurodevelopmental disability in and of itself. But today we'll be talking about it through the lens of a diagnosis that could be co-occurring with an intellectual and developmental disability that could be kind of exacerbating mental health challenges. What makes the intellectual and developmental disability population more vulnerable to these mental health challenges, given those increased prevalence numbers that we were just looking at? One domain is language or communication difficulties. So being able to talk about symptoms that you're experiencing, or frustration around not being able to have some of those basic needs met, or communicate things about yourself, or communicate your needs to the people who are supporting you. We also see challenges in coping or problem solving skills, and without the right tools or tools that are the right fit for an individual, that coping with day-to-day stressors can become much more escalated much more quickly, resulting in mental health challenges. We also know that limited social support in terms of being able to have peers and having a good group of people who you feel like are supportive of you and who you can connect with can be really impactful on mental health. And it's sort of what we would consider a logical response to feeling socially rejected or stigmatized in circles where you're trying to make connections. And this is, again, particularly prevalent in the time of COVID, when social access might be even more limited. We also think about a mismatch between environment and strengths, where we know that people with IDD have a different way of thinking about things sometimes, or have different ways that they're processing information, but their environment might not be a good match for how they do problem solve or how they do choose to cope. And that mismatch can cause a lot of stress. Why might mental health symptoms be missed? Oops. There we go. So when we're looking at picking out kind of individual symptoms of mental health diagnoses in the context of IDD, there are a lot of things that are going on that might make it hard for those working with them or providers in the community to pick up. So diagnostic overshadowing is one example of this. So diagnostic overshadowing is when challenges that are coming up are attributed to a primary diagnosis or to one single diagnosis, when actually there are multiple going on. There can also be a lot of symptom overlap in terms of how things present, and there can be a unique symptom presentation for how things like anxiety, depression, and ADHD appear in individuals with IDD. And it might not be sort of in those classic ways that we naturally think about anxiety and depression. There's also a significant impact of individual factors such as gender and intellectual ability. So having kind of a nuanced understanding of mental health conditions is challenging in such a way that captures how someone's individual characteristics interact with those mental health challenges in combination with an intellectual or developmental disability. And then, as I mentioned, again, thinking about limited ability to communicate emotions or challenges, that not being able to express in a way that other people are understanding that, hey, I'm really struggling, or I'm having a lot of really hard feelings or feeling down a lot of the time. So for example, when we're thinking about how can these things be missed, so taking autism and anxiety as an example. So in autism, we might see repetitive questions about a topic of interest, difficulty around transitions and unexpected changes, challenges with social relationships or withdrawal from social relationships, and a lot of sensory sensitivities. In anxiety disorders, we might see repetitive reassurance seeking, avoidance of situations accompanied by fearfulness, worry about social rejection, or anxious anticipation of a stimulus. So those kinds of repetitive questions could be related to an interest or could be based on fearfulness or avoidance of a situation. And it can often be hard in the moment to figure out, where is this stemming from? Again, thinking about difficulty with transitions and changes in expectations, that for someone with autism, that can be really hard. But where we see more anxiety coming into play might be when there's fearful anticipation of those transitions. So it's getting in the way day to day, above and beyond just kind of challenge around transitions in autism. So a lot of these things might look like the other without more nuance and more detailed examination of what are the challenges that are going on and how can we possibly put supports in place. I think it's also really important to note that lots of people experience worry, sadness, other challenges. These are completely normative human experiences. So feeling down for a day or feeling really worried about a particular thing coming up doesn't mean that a person has or qualifies for a diagnosis of depression or an anxiety disorder. Most of the time, these feelings for a lot of us come and go. You know, we might have a great day on Monday and kind of a crummy day on Tuesday. But when these symptoms are excessive and persistent and interfere with our daily lives, that's when it might be time to speak to a mental health professional and think about whether a diagnosis, a mental health related diagnosis, is appropriate. So specifically, we're looking for a significant change in behavior. So, there might be challenges that come up day to day. And when we see a significant change in how a person is presenting, and then that's resulting in potentially increased frequency of behavioral outbursts or more emotional volatility, if previously effective strategies no longer work. So if things were really tailored to the individual and it seems like, that form of support isn't addressing some of the challenges or some of the symptoms that a person is conveying, then that might indicate that something new or something else is going on. Again, thinking about how these symptoms might get overshadowed, we want to think about, can these symptoms be explained by developmental differences? So both in terms of the diagnosis, but also in developmental level. So for example, if someone is has a significant intellectual disability and is maybe doing schoolwork equivalent to a 5-year-old, but is a early teen or adolescent and is getting really frustrated and getting upset during classwork, that might be an emotional response that we expect to see for that developmental level. If we're thinking of what are the coping strategies and the responses that we might see for someone who is closer to that age of 5, then maybe that is an effective coping strategy for them. And maybe that is kind of age or developmentally appropriate. We also want to think about, again, how symptoms interfere with day-to-day functioning. So are you able to do the things still that you enjoy, get through the things that are required? We also are looking for persistence in symptoms. So are they present across multiple settings, and do they persist for at least a couple of weeks? And so that threshold is a little bit different for different diagnoses. But again, we're not looking for, kind of an off week, but is that persisting beyond a couple of weeks? It's also helpful to be aware of if there's a family history of mental health diagnoses. We know that a lot of these things are genetically heritable. So people with family history of anxiety or depression or ADHD are more likely to also have diagnoses of those things. To talk a little bit more specifically about what we're looking for related to each of these diagnoses. So for anxiety, specifically thinking about avoidance of certain situations or refusal to do things. There can also be a lot of physiological symptoms like shaking, stomach aches, headache, rapid heart rate. This can look different for a lot of people and sometimes feels more internal, which again calls into or calls up that question about how are we putting effective communication strategies into place to communicate about how is our body feeling. You might also see an increase in negative self-talk. So things like, I can't do this, or it's too scary, there's no way I'm going to do that. Requiring a lot of reassurance to be able to do things throughout the day. It can also look like unique worries, like not having time to engage with an interest. For example, in autism, thinking about how do these symptoms overlap and change one another? So preoccupation with a strong interest is very typical of what we see in autism. What is less typical is a fearfulness around, I'm not going to be able to engage with this or do this for as long as I want, or I don't know when the next time is that I'm going to get to do this thing that's really of interest to me. And when that becomes impairing in terms of, fear or anxiety about that, then that's when we're seeing those symptoms kind of coalesce, but the anxiety appearing above and beyond just symptoms of autism. Similarly, struggle with change or anticipated change in a routine can be hard. But where we see anxiety above and beyond that is when there is kind of preemptive worry around a change or around maybe there will be a change. So even if a person doesn't know that for sure there's going to be a change in the schedule, we might see a lot of fearfulness around, could there be a change? And that kind of worry is coming above and beyond symptoms of an IDD diagnosis alone. In depression, we would expect to see someone feeling sad or down for most of the day, for many days, a loss of interest or enjoyment in things that they used to like. And there also might be changes in sleep or eating pattern. And this can go in either direction. So we might see someone have a lot of difficulty sleeping when they're feeling depressed, or they might sleep a lot of the time or much more than usual. Similarly, with eating, you might see a loss in appetite or a significant increase in using food as a form of comfort or eating much more than usual. So looking for those significant changes in someone's usual pattern of sleep or eating. You might also see fatigue or loss of energy, decreased concentration, and again, thinking about concentration in the context of a person's developmental level and what is normative for them. Relatedly, you might expect to see worsening school performance and irritability or becoming easily annoyed, particularly in younger kids, even without intellectual and developmental disabilities. We know that depression symptoms might not always look clearly like sadness, but might look more like irritability or being easily angered in a way that wasn't present before. You might also see an increase in aggression or self-harm, self-deprecating statements like, I'm stupid, or I can't do this, I don't like myself, and also active or passive suicidal statements. So when we think about that difference between active and passive suicidal statements are something that we would consider without intent or a plan to follow through. So something like, I just wish I weren't alive, or I don't want to be here anymore. An active suicidal statement is more kind of conveying that intent to act. So I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to hurt myself. I want to grab a specific means. I want to grab a knife and hurt myself. And we'll talk more about, referrals, but in the case of active or passive suicidal statements, that really is a time when we want to think about calling a mental health provider and making sure that there are safety plans in place, which we'll talk about in more detail. Now thinking about ADHD, so the acronym stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I don't really love the term deficit in that name. I think it's more of a kind of lack of what's the word I'm looking for? Well, there's a specific word that kind of dysregulation. Sorry, that's the word that I was looking for. So attention dysregulation. The attention is there. It's just about regulating where is it going at a certain moment. So that can look like lack of focus and being easily distracted, but can also look like hyperfixation on something and difficulty shifting attention. So really dysregulation around where should my attention be at a given moment. This can also look like executive functioning challenges like disorganization. So having trouble kind of thinking about, what gets into my backpack and how do I get that in an organized manner. Difficulty with planning and task initiation, fidgeting or trouble sitting still. So more in that hyperactivity domain, having trouble staying in your seat, interrupting or intruding on other people. And this is an area where, again, it can be sort of hard to pick out the differences between an IDD and ADHD, because some of that social knowledge can be difficult and can result in impulsive comments or intruding on others, not understanding kind of the social nuances of an interaction so well. And so the thing about ADHD is that we're looking, well, with all of these, but in ADHD, we're looking for a variety of these symptoms. So intruding on others or interrupting on its own isn't kind of diagnostic of ADHD. We might also think of someone with ADHD as that person who's always on the go, who just needs to be constantly talking, constantly moving, and kind of has trouble regulating their energy level. And again, we're thinking about attention and activity level that's inappropriate for a developmental level. So if someone's cognitive and developmental abilities are closer to a younger child, then we might see, it's pretty common for a toddler to be much more active and much more on the move than a person who is, 12 to 15. And so when we're thinking about screening for mental health symptoms, especially as a non-mental health provider, thinking about how to interview and get some more information from caregivers or important people in the individual's life, and asking about the symptoms. So when did these onset? How long have the symptoms been present? How often are certain behaviors that might be indicative of a mental health condition happening? And how intense are those behaviors? It's also really important to consider factors that might be influencing changes in behavior, like other medical conditions, medications, or changes in medications. If there's been a change in sleep or appetite, external events like family changes, like move can be really stressful, or things like trauma that might be going on, and kind of understanding what is the broader context in which this person is functioning. It's also important to consider the impact of COVID as an external factor. So what is the impact on not just an individual, but on their family unit, on their access to services, on their day-to-day routine? Of course, direct observation of symptoms and having really detailed information about what's going on is really important. And then you can also administer appropriate screening tools. So there are screeners that are publicly available online that first of all, wouldn't consider diagnostic and should, of course, be used in context with other information, but can be helpful for kind of getting additional perspectives. So a lot of these can be given to caregivers and or filled out by teachers or other providers who know the person well. And so thinking about this as it is not diagnostic, but as a screener. So how can we gather more information about a specific diagnosis? So for anxiety, there's the screen for child anxiety related disorders, the ADAA free screening tool for anxiety. There's the PHQ-9 for adolescents and the CESD depression scale for children that screen for depression. And for ADHD, the NICHQ Vanderbilt scales, which gets at both inattention and hyperactivity or impulsivity, as well as more kind of challenging behaviors day to day, and some questions about anxiety or depression. So it's a little bit more of a broad screener. So as we were talking about in the objectives, first we want to talk through what are things that we can try first at home or in school or in a therapeutic setting to make an impact on some of these mental health related symptoms. And then next we'll talk about, when are symptoms so clear that it really requires a referral to a mental health professional. Anxiety and depression, there are a lot of different ways to kind of target these symptoms. So first, thinking about self-care strategies. So establishing regular self-care routines, which I think can sound like kind of an overly general statement when we think about self-care in the media or things like that now. Think of a bubble bath, things like that. We really want to think about self-care as being tailored to the individual. What is something that makes the person feel relaxed, calm, whether that's engaging with an interest. For some people, that might actually be taking a bubble bath. But what's something that can help your body regulate and take kind of mindful, effortful rest from the things that might be causing stress or worry? Relatedly, incorporating regular exercise and physical activity into the schedule, and so that doesn't have to look like taking on a comprehensive exercise program or making someone run laps, but just moving one's body can be really helpful. And we know that body movement, when that is an option for the person, that is something that really impacts mental health in a positive way. And again, thinking about how that can be tailored to an individual's abilities. So what can be done seated? So for example, chair yoga, which is something that you can kind of look up, and there are lots of nice visuals online, but something that can be done completely seated and just kind of moving arms, moving the torso. How could we do kind of stretching in the classroom or in a space without needing to kind of do things that might be challenging or frustrating for someone with fine or gross motor difficulties? It's also important to stay engaged in enjoyable activities. So like I said, thinking about self-care is something that's really tailored to what makes someone feel calm and rested. And so that might look like kind of creating more time to do things that feel rewarding and feel enjoyable, especially if we're seeing symptoms of anxiety or depression stemming from engaging in work or in tasks that feel frustrating or that are really kind of pushing a person to their limits, making sure that's balanced out with things that make them feel efficacious and competent, things that people are good at, and creating time for that as well. As much as possible, maintaining a regular sleep schedule is also really important for mental and physical health. And for a lot of individuals with IDD, sleep is an area of challenge. But thinking about, what are sleep routines that can help to promote a regular sleep schedule as much as possible. So some ideas thinking about how do we promote calm and self-care. So calm body activities can look like squeezing a stress ball, or there's also an approach called progressive muscle relaxation, and there are a lot of different scripts available online, but that looks like kind of systematically squeezing and releasing different parts of your body. The idea that things like squeezing a stress ball can seem simple, but it also really teaches us that we know how to identify tension in our bodies. That if you can feel what tense feels like, you can also feel what letting go and relaxing feels like. Deep breathing is something that's also often talked about. And I think, sometimes we hear kids getting tired of people telling them to take a deep breath, but thinking about that as being something that does really help regulate the body and help to calm down. And so playing around with what works for an individual. So for some people, that visual of, you can look up kind of square breathing. So taking 4 seconds of breath in up one side, out for 4, and then in for 4, and kind of around the square is a visual that helps some people. Smelling the flower or blowing the candle, which is pictured here. So teaching someone, smell the flower, blow out the candle. So making deep breathing something that is accessible by creating systems that support it visually. Again, thinking about exercise, whatever that looks like, as being something that helps to calm the body, even if it seems like someone, that encouraging more movement, we sometimes think about that as getting kids amped up, but that doing kind of big body movements can really help to calm down and regulate. Sensory activities or fidget toys can also be really helpful in calming down and thinking about accommodations around, how can we make sure that someone has something that does help to keep them regulated or help to keep them calm in situations when it might not otherwise be appropriate. So for example, allowing someone to have a fidget toy in the classroom because that's actually promoting attention versus being something that's distracting. And for a lot of kids, deep pressure, like a hug or a weighted blanket, things like that are also things that can be helpful. In terms of calm mind activities, using helpful thoughts and positive talk. So really teaching kind of mantras around, I can do this, I'm brave, I've got this. Having helpful thoughts that at first seem kind of rote, but having something that they're able to rely on in the moment when they're feeling worried or overwhelmed can really be a nice thing to fall back on. We also think about fighting fears with facts. So having, again, some of these kind of mantras to think about, can I push back on this thing that I'm worried about? Is this a false alarm? Or is this just my worry talking right now? Also incorporating opportunities for mindfulness. And so mindfulness for kids who are able, there are lots of kind of meditation apps and things like that. But it can also look like doing something, mindfully. So having something that kind of absorbs your focus so that you're able to just kind of be in that moment. So that can, there are those kind of water toys that you see where the confetti kind of goes back and forth. That can be really calming just to focus on a particular stimulus for a few minutes, or drawing kind of rhythmically can be helpful to just focus on, what am I doing in this moment? For a lot of people, thinking about a favorite activity or interest can also be a mood booster and can help to calm worried or sad thoughts. We also want to think about behavioral manifestations of anxiety and depression. So as I mentioned, irritability or tantrums and upset can become much more frequent when we're seeing some of those symptoms. So first and foremost, just providing additional support. Is it that, can I offer additional time, additional effort in kind of creating support for this individual? And also, how am I managing expectations related to that person's developmental level? So constantly kind of reframing, is this a developmentally appropriate behavior, or is this something that we wouldn't expect given this person's ability level? I also want to think about preparing for new situations using visual supports. So I'm a big advocate of using visuals wherever possible. And so having visuals that prepare someone for a situation can really decrease that worry. And I think often when we talk about things like visual schedules, there's a pull to think that having something like that increases rigidity, when actually we know that it typically does the opposite. So that having a visual that you can use flexibly creates more flexibility over time. And that can look like having, routinely putting changes in the schedule. And so change in and of itself becomes predictable, that we know, okay, here's a visual that shows me what I can expect for the day. But I also know that someone will tell me and show me if a change is upcoming. And when we think about behavioral strategies, we want to think about them as being a consistent part of effective teaching, intervention, and interaction. That, even outside of the context of depression and anxiety, that a lot of the things that we'll talk about today are really beneficial, regardless of whether some of those symptoms are coming up. So these are some examples of what visual schedules might look like being tailored to an individual's developmental level. So for a younger child or someone who's operating at the developmental level of a younger child, we think about object schedules. So things that bring someone into the environment. So you can have kind of a transition object, like a pencil brings you into the drawing area. And so I know, okay, you handed me this pencil, it's time for me to transition there. And then I am handed my cup, and now I know that it's time to go to lunch. It can also incorporate pictures. So using a first then schedule, just having kind of a small chunk of the day being pictured in the schedule. So we want to think about both how much information is being presented, what is the format of that information, and how is the person interacting with it. So with kind of pure objects, the person is physically holding the object that's moving them into the next space. With a picture schedule or a written schedule, we think about that as something that's being posted. And then, for a written schedule, you could kind of check off each thing. It's also nice for pictures if there can be kind of a spot to put things when they're finished. So I pull, the computer icon off and I put it in, the finished pocket. And now I know that, here, what's left on my schedule is what I have left for the day. And so thinking about what is a person's reading level and how much information can they handle at once that feels predictable and that feels kind of safe in having this amount of information. We also want to talk about CBT strategies or cognitive behavioral therapy. And so for those who aren't familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's really kind of an evidence-based approach to mental health intervention that focuses on how do we both target thoughts and behavior simultaneously. And I think there's often kind of an idea that for individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities that these strategies aren't effective. But there's a lot of emerging research that shows adaptations and modifications to CBT approaches that really can make them accessible for people of all levels. And so for people who are verbally expressing their feelings, validating and labeling those feelings, or even if someone is non-speaking and isn't kind of out loud saying those feelings, trying to acknowledge the things that are stressful or how a person might be feeling. For example, I saw that you weren't included in that game. It seems like you're feeling really sad right now. So thinking about how do we validate that emotional experience? And so when we think about, feelings and feeling down or sad or worried, that when we're trying to intervene or trying to provide support, we're not trying to tell someone this isn't a feeling that you should have. We're trying to validate that feeling and say, okay, it's okay to have that feeling. And it makes sense that you have that feeling. But how do we cope with that feeling, or how do we react to that in a way that is positive or that is adaptive? We also want to teach individuals to have their own self-efficacy in being able to boost themselves up. So practicing positive self-talk. So again, having some of those positive self-statements become mantras of I can do this, or I'm brave, I'm smart. And then countering those negative thoughts. So using some of that positive self-talk or mantras to push back against negative thoughts. And that can look different for different developmental levels. So that can look a little bit like what we talked about previously, fighting fears with facts. So what's the evidence that I have for this worried thought? So if I'm experiencing a worry of bugs, how can I think about, okay, like, is a bug probably gonna hurt me? Or how likely is it that I'm gonna encounter, a tarantula on my walk outside of my school? So thinking about how do we tailor that to an individual's developmental level. We also want to encourage and reward brave behavior to face fears. So over time, I think, there's often an urge to protect. And so if someone's saying, I'm so scared of bugs, I can't go outside, or, they're having a meltdown every time they go outside out of a fear of interacting with a bug or something like that. There's a pull to say, okay, how do we arrange our day? How do we arrange our schedule so that this individual can stay inside as much as possible and we don't have to deal with this worry. But we know that fighting fears and actually facing those fears are really important to be able to handle and manage anxiety. So how can I kind of encourage someone to face their fears and reward that behavior? So can we step outside the door for just 2 minutes today? And providing a lot of praise, a lot of reward for those behaviors, and encouraging more and more brave behaviors over time. And again, using visuals to support understanding of and communication about emotions. So for example, having kind of a visual array of different emotions and paired with images of how someone might look when they're feeling that way. And then some visuals of coping strategies that a person could try. So allowing even for someone who has a hard time speaking when they're feeling overwhelmed or is non-speaking, and giving them a way to communicate about their feelings. So I feel mad. I want to get a hug. And that could be a nice way of communicating what a person needs and is feeling in that moment. It can also be a nice way to express what is causing some of those feelings to come up. So for this example, the iPad is broken. I feel mad. There are also some different ways to think about, how big is this problem, for example. So can I look at this visual and think about, okay, I'm having a really big reaction and it's okay to feel mad about this. It makes sense to feel mad. But how big is this problem that I'm having right now? And can I learn to kind of calm down and acknowledge when something isn't such a big problem? Having a visual array of options for coping strategies and really allowing choice. We want to promote autonomy and, coping strategies that someone can use for themselves. So thinking about how do we visually present this information so that it's really accessible and so that, they can either kind of just look and select for themselves. Okay, I see my options. I'm going to try some belly breathing right now. Or can I, bring this to someone and I can just show without having to talk, without having to create more stress, that I want to take a break right now. I need to, spend some time outside of this environment. JFK Partners has also developed, or specifically Dr. Judy Reven has developed an intervention called Facing Your Fears, which we really enjoy using with individuals with social communication challenges and anxiety. And within that intervention, there's a lot of incorporation of visuals around thinking about, well, what does my body look like when I'm worried? And also identifying what we call a worry bug. So externalizing that worry. So is this a real fear or is this just my worry bug right now that's kind of getting in my way? And so that creates a really nice, simple interaction around helping a child think about, is this a real fear? Is this a false alarm? Is this just my worry bug kind of creeping up? Next, thinking about managing ADHD and specifically thinking about behavioral strategies to support positive behaviors and engagement throughout the day. So preemptively scheduling movement breaks. And we want to think about in all of these situations, how do we proactively prepare an environment so that it is the best fit for the individual and promotes success? So scheduling movement breaks, building in stimulation with fidget toys or modified seating to make sure there is that kind of sensory input, limiting distractions as much as possible. So in the home environment, this might look like creating, a quiet space, even if that just looks like a section of a shared room where there are slightly fewer distractions to be able to focus. Using reward or behavior reinforcement systems, especially to kind of break things into chunks. So, okay, here's your task, you do 5 of these math problems, and then take a break and you get, a check mark on your behavioral reward system. And you do 5 more problems and you get a check on your behavioral reward system. And then at the end of the night, maybe you've earned, a couple minutes of iPad time or, a fun game as a family. So again, breaking those large tasks into smaller chunks that feel manageable and feel less overwhelming, which I think honestly is a good strategy for any of us to think about how to approach things that might feel daunting. But thinking about a child with ADHD and especially ADHD and IDD, that giving all of the work that they have to do for the day all at once would feel really overwhelming. And so how do we make this feel more manageable? Another way to make it feel more manageable is to create clear organization systems. So again, encouraging autonomy and self-sufficiency by, if you're, losing things day to day, okay, well, here is, a coat rack for when you get home. And on each of these hooks is a picture of what should go here. So coat goes here, your backpack goes here, and your shoes go right here. And so the next morning, that's where they all are. And so thinking about how can we create systems that make sense to the individual and kind of promote organization and accessibility in using those systems. Again, using visual supports to track tasks, especially as they're broken into those chunks, and shift between activities can be really helpful. So as I previously talked about, we don't think about it as just that distractibility, but also difficulty shifting away from things that are really stimulating or that are really enjoyable and on to the next thing. So in those situations, we might think of using something like a pause card. And this is just a visual cue and a reminder that, hey, this isn't finished forever. I can come back to this thing that I'm really enjoying. I just have to do a little bit of work, or I have to do something else first, and then I can come back. So it's not a removal. It's not a stop forever. I'm just going to pause. These are also some examples of what these organization systems, or what we call work systems, can look like at different developmental levels. So this is an example of, a folder system. And so this is working left to right. So having a clear pattern for how work is done. And so, first I do the purple folder, then the green folder, then the blue folder, and then I'm finished. And so that those folders are in front of the person in a little, a folder holder, and you're moving left to right through the folder and putting them into a finished pile when each folder is done. This can also be really tactile, so using objects. So here's an example of a work system that uses kind of color matching. So I'm gonna, first on my schedule is the number 1. So I find the red 1. I'm gonna do all the things that are in this bin, and then I put it in finished. Next, I know I need to do 2. Here's the task that's in this bin. I'm gonna do this task, and then it goes to finished. In terms of being able to shift between tasks, so again, that pause card is really helpful, but also thinking about a countdown. And so I really like thinking about using these countdowns as often more effective than something like a timer, because you're in control of the countdown. So for example, if you're a parent and you have to get out the door, but your child is really interested in a show on the iPad, and showing them, okay, we have 15 more and then we're all done, and checking off visually so they can see, how much do I have left, so that it's not a surprise when they get to the bottom. But what's nice about a visual countdown is that it's not tied to time. And so if you tell child, for example, you can watch for 3 more minutes, and you have a kid who's pretty rigid about time or about their expectations, then you're probably not going anywhere before exactly 3 minutes, even if you end up needing to leave a little bit faster. Or if they end up having a little bit more time, then there's no room for adjustment when you're giving these kind of concrete time constraints. So thinking about, checking off down a list. This could also look like, using something that's a strong interest. So I've seen one that has, Legos Velcroed to a strip, and for every unit of time, whatever that unit is, kind of pulling off a Lego, and then they can see how many Legos they have left until they're all done. So this is really adaptable for someone's interests and also their developmental level. COVID-related challenges have been also a really important thing to think about in terms of how are we identifying and tailoring supports. And so more than ever, creating and following a schedule provides some predictability and a sense of control in a time that's felt really uncertain for all of us, and especially for kids and adolescents with IDD. So using schedules to put in planned times for self-care and for high interest, rewarding activities throughout the day. It's also really important to, as much as possible, identifying COVID-safe forms of social connection. And so different families and different Service centers have different protocols and different levels of comfort, but thinking about, how can we, create systems for, like, for example, bringing in drawings about what your home looks like if it's been that, you can't have friends over, or bringing in pictures and trying to share around that. Of course, outdoor play, if that's something that your family is comfortable with, is something that we'd really encourage and think about as being, a slightly safer way to have those interactions. I know that Zoom fatigue is real, and that a lot of the individuals we work with have a harder time over kind of e-learning or virtual interventions, and maybe having social time over Zoom as well is kind of the last thing that they want. But for some people, that might be a really nice opportunity to be able to connect with classmates when there are fewer play dates outside of school or things like that. So just thinking about what are ways that we can kind of foster connection. In addition to scheduling some of these opportunities for self-care and social interaction, scheduling worry time is also something that we might think about, both in terms of general anxiety, but also specifically related to COVID, that if we let it, that these thoughts and these worries could take over a lot of our day and could really derail our whole day. And so these are valid things to worry about. And so the idea isn't to say, okay, well, don't worry about this or stop worrying about this, but how can we constrain the worry time to kind of a space of the day so that it's not fully taking over? So, 15 minutes a day, here's when we're all, maybe as a family or maybe like multiple kids together, we're going to talk about the things that are on our mind that we're feeling worried about or stressed about. And, or for, someone who's watching or engaging with the news a lot, limiting access to those resources, or limiting kind of, the time when they're going to be accessing those resources to a certain time of day. And I think fundamentally, when we're thinking about schedules and, creating these kind of opportunities to interact with others or to even have this worried time, we want to think about how choice really is an important part of feeling like we have some control in a time that feels kind of wildly out of control. So at every opportunity possible, letting someone pick, okay, which activity do you want to put next on the schedule? Or, which calm down activity do you want to try? If there is, sort of work to do, do you want to do this math first or reading first? And so thinking about, just creating opportunities to feel like you have a little more sense of control and feeling like there's more autonomy day to day. Mental health symptoms can also present as quote unquote challenging behaviors. And so there's been kind of movement around this broad term of challenging behaviors because it's not specific, and can also put a negative connotation onto things that are totally normative and developmentally appropriate, like stimming or getting, interested in, or having trouble shifting away from a strong interest. When I'm talking about challenging behaviors, I'm thinking more about things like things that are challenging both for a provider, parent, or teacher, and for the individual. So having big meltdowns, aggressive behaviors, self-injurious behaviors, things that really disrupt someone's quality of life. And so without appropriate intervention and support, those kinds of behaviors can really impact social relationships as well as quality of life, decrease access to educational or intervention opportunities, increase risk for injury, and also can increase, frustration for those working with them, and can be associated with higher risk of abuse. And so thinking about the function of behavior is really important. So, when we think about what purpose is a behavior serving, these are kind of the categories that we're first thinking about. So is someone trying to communicate, escape or avoid a situation, get access to social attention, access to a tangible thing, or try to gain some sensory stimulation? So to figure out what the function of a behavior is, and if it's related to a mental health diagnosis or just efforts to communicate, and maybe there are systems that can be put in place or access to a tangible, then how do we think about identifying, is this related to mental health symptoms? So first, we want to think about just describing really clearly and really specifically the behavior that is causing challenges. We also want to identify the antecedent and consequence events. So what's happening immediately before this behavior occurs and what happens as a result? And so when we think about consequence, we want to think about not consequence in the terms of punishment necessarily, but consequence in the terms of what is the kind of resulting events that happen afterwards. So for example, if I, hit my provider and my provider walks away from me, that's the consequence behavior. So after I do this, then this happens. And so through all this, we're considering the function of the behavior. So what was the goal? And then we want to think about designing an intervention or designing supports that either replace the behavior with something that's more adaptive or that serves a similar function. So it's often helpful to think about, especially related to self-injury, elopement or aggression towards others, destructive behaviors, that all of these things are trying to communicate a need or a certain function that we need to identify. And so data collection is a really important part of functional behavioral assessment. So this is an example of a pretty straightforward, what's called an ABC analysis, so antecedent, behavior, consequence. And just an example of that data taking doesn't have to take a ton of time. It doesn't have to be super lengthy, but really clearly describing, what was happening first before the behavior. So for this first line, teacher announces that it's time for reading. George tells an inappropriate joke, and then his peers laugh and the class is disrupted. So we think about that possible function being, okay, maybe he wants some social attention from his peers. He got some laughter and some interaction, or maybe escape. And so that's just one example. And so throughout the day, you can see that a lot of these behaviors are happening related to what happens around reading time. So being called on to read, being asked to pay attention, moving into a reading group. And so what originally seemed like, okay, maybe escape, maybe some social attention, seems like a pretty clear avoidance of reading time. So then we want to think about how do we address that in a proactive versus reactive way. And it seems like for George that reading might be challenging. So first, can we think about, how do we get some extra supports around reading, for example, or put more things in place that would allow him to feel successful in those contexts. We also think about positive behavioral approaches as broadly requiring us to kind of tell people what we want them to do versus what not to do. So please listen quietly sets the expectation before interruption or disruption happens versus don't interrupt in the moment. So saying don't interrupt doesn't tell a child what they're expected to do. It only tells them what you want them not to do. Praise and encouragement should also be frequent and really specific. So while any praise is super nice, just saying good job is a lot less specific than praising a specific behavior. So saying great job asking for help. So for George, for example, praising him for raising his hand and saying, hey, I'm having trouble reading this. Could you help me? And that specific kind of praise really encourages continued use of those behaviors that got that reward. As part of positive behavioral approach, we also want to validate emotions and give tools to teach self-expression. So again, calling back to some of those CBT strategies. So for George saying, I know reading is tough for you and you seem really frustrated right now. So being able to feel like someone else sees what you're feeling and understands that, and that it's okay to feel that is a really important part of promoting positive behavior. We also want to kind of think about differentiating attention to behaviors that are positive versus those that might be disruptive or cause challenges. So ignoring low-level behaviors when possible. So that isn't things like, ignoring a child when they're hitting themselves or if they're injuring another person, but things like, getting out of a seat and just kind of, walking around or making a silly joke. If we reduce the amount of attention to those kinds of behaviors, they're more likely to decrease over time. In times of upset, and again, all of these positive behavioral approaches, we're kind of talking about them in the context of mental health, but are really important for promoting positive learning and intervention environments broadly. So in times of upset, thinking about reducing language, and so in general, trying to tailor instruction to be matched to a person's language level, but even further, reducing language when someone is upset. So even for someone who's extremely verbally fluent, that when you're feeling upset or overwhelmed or really frustrated, that having a lot of language being thrown at you can just add to that frustration and kind of add to that feeling of dysregulation. We also want to think about pairing language with visual supports and providing visual means to communicate needs or feelings. And so I really want to encourage, the use of visuals at all developmental levels, that for most of the kids that working with, that having a visual support, even for someone who is a very, fluid reader or can speak very fluidly, that having some visual support to make expectations clear and to make sure that there are ways that they're able to communicate when they're at their most dysregulated. So when we think about developing these systems, we want to make sure that they're tailored for the moment when a person is having their hardest time possible and not when they're at their very best. So think about, what's something that someone could use at any moment of dysregulation. We also, as we've been saying throughout, provide opportunities for success and incorporate choices when possible. So for George, our example from the ABC template, so thinking about, okay, reading is really challenging for him, but what is George really great at? And can we put that after reading time? Maybe he is much stronger in math. So how do we kind of buffer that with things that he feels efficacious in and that make him feel good about himself? And again, coming back to scheduling time for breaks and preferred activities. I think when possible, it's also really helpful to establish clear locations where someone can go to calm down. And I think, in looking at, so here's an example of something like that might look like, but it doesn't have to be elaborate. It can just be sort of, a quiet corner or a place that's consistent and that feels like I can go here and I'm safe to practice my calm down routine. I think what's really important to emphasize is that we can't expect people to use things when they're upset that they haven't been taught when they're calm and ready to learn. So incorporating regular practice of calm down routines. So, doing deep breathing and doing some, body movement and some mindfulness practice every day, even if it's just for a few minutes a day, really makes it much more likely that someone is able to use those tools when they are upset or dysregulated. And so we want to think about that as being almost kind of like muscle memory. Like my body knows what to do. I know how to get to a place that feels calmer and where I feel like I'm able to better communicate about what's going on for me or what I'm feeling. If you do have the space for something a little more elaborate, it's really nice to have visuals or kind of baskets that have some calm down tools. For some kids, having a pinwheel is a nice thing to promote actual deep breathing with they're kind of blowing a pinwheel instead of just trying to deep breathe, or having some of those sensory tools and stress balls kind of in a consistent place where someone is able to go and take a break. These are also some examples of what it looks like to incorporate choice. And again, this can really be tailored to a developmental level. So for some kids, it might be just verbally offering choices. For others, it might be having options written out and they get to just point or pick one or move it to kind of a visual spot that shows their choice. This example at the bottom also shows just ways to communicate about what you need in a moment. So having kind of a variety of common options so that they're able to have a system to share what their needs are in the moment. Oops. So I tried to provide a lot of strategies that can foster a positive environment and can support mental health in a variety of contexts. But we also want to think about, when do we know that we need to refer to a mental health professional? So first of all, if a crisis arises, such as a suicide attempt, active suicidal ideation. So again, those statements that imply clear intent and a plan. If there is a self-injury. And so we think about, that self-injury as different than kind of repetitive behavior types of self-injury. So, an escalation in self-injury that looks very different than what people might have been engaging in before, or kind of clear self-injury that is meant to cause significant harm. Elopement and dangerous impulsivity. So escalations in those areas are also really concerning, and we'd recommend that you seek professional intervention immediately. We also want to think about anxiety and sadness that are excessive, persistent, and interfering with daily life. So again, that fluctuations in mood and having days where there's a lot of worry or a lot of sadness is completely normative. But we want to think about what is excessive for this individual, knowing what their baseline is, and are those persisting across time. We also want to think about, again, that baseline point. So behaviors that are a significant change. So changes in sleep and appetite, withdrawal more than usual, or frequent tearfulness, or increased aggression or impulsivity. We might also see, for some individuals, kind of a decreased sleep need or increase in activity level, far beyond, what we think about for something like ADHD, where if someone's kind of baseline is relatively active, but we see a clear escalation in those behaviors, that would also be something to consult with a mental health professional about. It's also important to note that you can refer to a mental health professional whenever it would be helpful to have that professional support. You don't have to wait for a crisis to come up or to feel like things are kind of getting out of control. That we want to think about, again, that proactive versus reactive approach. How do we mitigate symptoms or prevent them from becoming worse over time? And so at any point when it feels like having consultation or the support of a mental health professional, then that's the right time to refer to. So where to refer? So thinking about, how do we, when you go on, for example, like Psychology Today or some of these websites, it can be really overwhelming to parse through, what are the resources around me and who can I refer to? So the important things to look at are providers who are able to tailor treatments to the strengths and needs of an individual using evidence-based approaches. And so this might look different in different communities of what providers or centers or settings are available, but really trying to figure out, are they tailoring to the individual person that I'm referring, and are they using an evidence-based approach? Contacting a school mental health team is also a really great resource. So as a first line, kind of putting in additional mental health supports at school or in the setting in which a child spends the most of their time. And that school team also likely has additional resources to be able to refer to if needed. So in the handout, you'll get copies of all of these resources. But thinking about mental health referrals. So again, contacting your local mental health center. The Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies also has a tool for finding a CBT therapist in your area. And so that helps to kind of screen for some of that evidence-based approach. There are also the Colorado Crisis Services, which should be contacted in those cases of suicidality or suicidal ideation. As this webinar will be kind of archived on the JFK website, there are also a variety of other webinars that are readily available for you to watch and review. We are, as I mentioned, the Facing Your Fears program that we run at JFK. We are currently recruiting right now for a study that is adapting the Facing Your Fears intervention, which is an intervention specifically for individuals with social communication challenges. So the study we have going on right now is looking at individuals with social communication challenges and diagnoses of intellectual disability for ages 12 to 18, I believe. I'll put up a flyer at the end so you can see all that information in detail, but that's ongoing right now, and we're starting groups pretty soon. There's also school-based Facing Your Fears intervention, and you can contact Dr. Judy Reven about access to some of that curriculum. There are also some COVID-19 specific supports listed here. So thinking about how to manage anxiety and worry around COVID and how to kind of cope as a family. So there are some resources in this webinar and a variety of other online learning resources and partners listed here. Finally, thinking about caregiver support. And so, having a team that feels taken care of, as well as important for maintaining mental health for the children and teens that we serve. So the Peak Parent Center provides a variety of resources for parents. The Living Spectrum also offers parent groups, and El Grupo de Vida is also a network specifically for Hispanic and Latina parents around supporting individuals with disabilities or special needs. All right, and thank you so much for listening. Now kind of field any questions, and I'm going to quickly share the flyer for our Facing Your Fears study.
Rachel, thank you so much. I know you're putting that up there. Excellent. I know that was a lot of really great information, and I think people will be really excited to get the handouts. I was looking through the chat, and I think there's at least a couple of questions I think would be really helpful for you to address. Mm-hmm. One is about, and I think it's like a really timely question right now, which is, Pfizer just approved vaccinations for kids 5 to 11. Mm-hmm. And some of our kids are going to be getting vaccinations, and there may be some fear, anxiety, upset attached to getting a shot. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you could talk through how families can approach that if they know that their child has had some problems getting vaccines or shots in the past.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there are a couple of different things to consider when thinking about challenges around getting shots. Spoken to someone who does not like getting shots. So first we want to think about, is this kind of rising to a level of a phobia around needles or shots, and how can we face fears around that? But first, if there's sort of, it feels kind of scary and overwhelming, how do we make it feel just a little bit less scary and overwhelming? So considering things like social stories, and there are lots of examples of social stories readily available online. So thinking about how do we visually prepare someone for everything that they're going to expect that day. And again, thinking about developmental level. So for some people or for some kids, that might be kind of just literally reading some information about what to expect that day. But having, pictures of what the doctor's office looks like, having kind of a picture or information and pictures about the steps. So first we're going to walk into the building. We're going to sit in the waiting room. What does the waiting room look like? How long might I expect to be in the waiting room? And then what'll it look like when I'm inside of the space? The challenging thing about COVID is that obviously that limits sort of more public access to things, where we might think about worries about shots in general, that spending some time at the office or being in that space ahead of time and practicing some coping strategies and practicing, fighting fears with facts while in that setting would be really helpful. And that might be an option for certain doctors' offices. it might not be given COVID restrictions, but you could also potentially ask if the office is willing to provide, a patient-free picture of what their waiting room looks like and what the office looks like where the child will be sitting. And honestly, thinking about it being something that it makes sense to be a little worried about shots. They don't feel good. And so validating those feelings and that, saying, I had a shot and yeah, I didn't like it very much, but now I feel safer and I feel healthier. And now we can go out into the world. And so thinking about those kind of broad rewards and modeling of brave behavior, as well as really creating a specific high value reward for getting that shot. And I think unlike things where you don't want to be promising, a huge reward for day-to-day behaviors, that's really hard to maintain. You could think about really upping the ante for something like a shot that doesn't come up all the time. I know the Teach Autism program also has a little resource thing that has what they call teach tips. And so one of those is they have kind of a visual schedule and social story around getting a COVID test, which isn't quite the same, but that might be a nice model to think about how do I start to create a social story for this kind of interaction.
Great, thank you, Rachel. We have just a few more minutes left, and people can feel free to either unmute and ask a question directly or throw something in the chat. I know that there were a couple of quick questions around the FYF group for teens. So just to clarify, yeah, that's a project that we're involved in for the next 3 years. And the age range is 12 to 18. We're interested in adolescents with diagnoses of autism, intellectual disability, anxiety, other social communication challenges that might meet research criteria for an autism diagnosis. And so we would encourage you to contact us directly around that. We're actively recruiting and excited about the project. And even if you're not sure if a child you work with or teen you work with qualifies, I think it's totally fine just to reach out to us, and then we'll help see if it's a good fit. So putting in a plug for that.
And I did just upload the flyer into the chat, so you should be able to open and download that for yourselves.
And share it broadly. All right. Are there other questions, comments that folks might have?
My name is Abby. Can you please speak to the younger children, the elementary school children?
I think your sound cut out in the middle there. I only heard, could you speak to an elementary school children?
Yep. Facing Your Fears, that program for the younger kids. Mm-hmm. Is there a flyer on that as well? Or
there actually is one that we okay. Let me see if I can find that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can attach that in the chat. But that's something that you can reach out to developmental pediatrics at Children's Colorado to get, or actually you can email me directly. I manage the wait list for Facing Your Fears. There's been a little bit of shifting in where that wait list is, but I manage that wait list. So feel free to email me. Don't put it in the chat here because that will probably get lost. But my email address is on the slides, and I'll put my email address in the chat. Just feel free to email me information about your child or the person that you're interested in referring, and we can go ahead and get them added.
Thank you.
And I'll just, Abby, thank you for raising that. I'm going to just put in one more plug about some school-based intervention. So some of you may have attended the JFK conference that we had in early October, where I chat a little bit about some of our work with public schools, training individuals in interdisciplinary teams in public schools to deliver Facing Your Fears. So I know that there are a number of folks on this in this webinar who do work directly in schools, so that if that is something you are interested in, feel free to reach out to us directly. We've been in touch with and have worked actively with Cherry Creek, Littleton, and Denver, and are really interested in wanting to expand beyond that as well. So anyway, feel free to reach out to us. You can use Rachel's email, or I think in the resource guide, there's also my email too. So that would be great.
Thank you.
All All right. Any other questions from folks? Well, I don't.
Rachel, awesome job, by the way. That was one of the best presentations ever. That was awesome.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Oh, I don't see anything else in the chat, and I know we have just another couple of minutes, so I'm feeling like it would make sense to kind of end a couple minutes early and let everybody get on with your day. And yeah, so thank you so much for attending. We appreciate you logging on with us. And thanks to Dr. Rachel Sandercock for a fantastic presentation. And yeah, I think that's.
I did just see there's a question about working with adults and if there are special referrals for them. That's a great question. So JFK, we see kind of across the lifespan, that's more kind of evaluation and individual therapy. And to be honest, the individual therapy wait list is rather long, but there are resources through your community-centered boards for adults. There are also, depending on what kind of services you're looking for, vocational rehab can offer a lot of information about things like job skills and transition services. So those might be great points of contact. And if you want to email me, I'm also happy to provide some more resources or provide some more specific resources depending on what you're looking for adults. Adults are one of my passions in working with adults and making sure that there are good transition services and supports across the lifespan. So always excited to talk more about that.
Great.
Can I ask one more question? This is Abby. Let me know if you can't hear me, but my son is 5 years old and he was just diagnosed through the state, I guess, or registered as having an IDD. So this is all new to me. He was born with Down syndrome and now we have autism diagnosis as well. And so I'm really trying to learn. And he's been at the Rise School of Denver. We love you, JFK, Lisa Swenson. She's been there. And so now we're going into the public schools. Is that something I could call your organization and talk to someone about, just some kind of transitional questions I have, or is there somewhere else I would go?
Yeah, Judy, I don't know if you have.
It sounds like a really specific question, Abby. What I might suggest is you can reach out with a specific question to us sort of offline, and then we can direct you to the right folks.
Thank you.
I think that's a good way to go. All right. Well, unless we don't have any other questions, unless we have any others, I think we can probably sign off for folks. So again, we are really appreciative of the great questions, the attention to this webinar, and we wish you all a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all.